It's hard to believe that even a single fan of Final Fantasy remains unfamiliar with the origin of the series' name. It's simply common knowledge that, after a string of disappointments at Square, Hironobu Sakaguchi suggested the name Final Fantasy, assuming the first game would be his swan song. As such, I'm sure the majority of fans consider the title an ironic historic contingency. As the years have rolled on and the releases have piled up, it's become more and more difficult for anyone to imagine a Final Fantasy. With that said, the series' apparent pursuit of immortality doesn't necessarily mean that the title Final Fantasy has ceased to be appropriate. In fact, I'd argue that the concept of final remains critical to the series' very nature. According to Hajime Tabata, Hironobu Sakaguchi expressed a desire for him to make Final Fantasy a challenger again, approaching the project believing this was our last chance, so if we don't do it this time, there won't be a next time. This, Sakaguchi told Tabata, was where the final in Final Fantasy comes from originally. In a strange way then, the first Final Fantasy was almost a mythic autobiography, a set of developers who felt the order of their studio threatening to fall apart around them and saw themselves as given one last chance to save it, responded by crafting a setting where the natural order was threatened with destruction, where the very elements have been corrupted, and where the world's last desperate hope is the warriors of light, who have been chosen to forestall utter annihilation. What is Final Fantasy? Final Fantasy is a myth, the myth of heroes chosen to restore an order which is all but lost, in the face of all but impossible odds. Stories about saving the world aren't unique to Final Fantasy, of course, but Final Fantasy has consistently chosen to make its conflicts final in another way. The crystal is uniquely ubiquitous in Final Fantasy. Characters change, settings come and go, but as far as the franchise is concerned, the light of the crystal shines eternal. Perfect in structure and seemingly incorruptible, crystal represents the ultimate cosmic order, or in other words, everything worth fighting for. Final Fantasy isn't about saving a princess or protecting a kingdom from a Dark Lord. It's about preserving the ultimate, final, order of all that is. Sometimes that means being explicitly chosen by the crystal to protect it against chaos, or a deluge of darkness worthy of the biblical flood, or a mishmash monstrosity seeking to return all of existence to the void. Other times, it means being the only ones capable of defeating a tyrant who's released hell on earth, or the embodiment of human hatred, or a half-angelic, half-demonic, nihilistic clown god. Regardless of the exact nature of the final boss, however, each of the classic Final Fantasy games revolve around the need to preserve final order against the chaos that seems all but guaranteed to overwhelm it. While Final Fantasy has never abandoned the concept of a singular ultimate conflict, however, the nature of that conflict began to change around the same time that the series made its way to PlayStation. Classic Final Fantasy never questioned the goodness of the final order symbolized by the crystal. The term order might have sometimes been shifted to balance, but that did nothing to change the ultimate goal of simultaneously preserving the world's fundamental nature and the good of the people within it. This all changed with Final Fantasy VII. For the first time, FF7 raised the specter that what was good for the world might not necessarily be good for humanity. Final Fantasy VIII followed that up with an even more damaging blow against tradition, by positing that humanity itself was created by an evil god, suggesting that the fundamental order of reality was ultimately corrupt, a concept which spread like wildfire, finding a home in games like Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy XII, and ultimately forming the basis of Fabula Nova Crystallis, and therefore Final Fantasy XIII. Even Final Fantasy IX, despite being marketed as a return to tradition, left the natural order feeling far more hostile to humanity than any of the classic games, by attempting to present an existentialist justification of life in the face of imminent death. The threat in each of these games was final in the sense of being of ultimate consequence, and many of them were still directed at their setting's fundamental order. But something important had still shifted. The myth of classic Final Fantasy had been subverted. And then came Sakaguchi's request to make Final Fantasy a challenger again. As controversial as Final Fantasy XV might have been, it was the first time in 2 decades that a mainline Final Fantasy sought to return to the original myth. Was it merely a coincidence that it was also the first time in who knows how long that a Final Fantasy game wasn't guaranteed a sequel? That the developers had a valuable order to preserve rather than a legacy to subvert and surpass? I'd argue that one of the things that makes Final Fantasy XV great is that it, like the first Final Fantasy, is a mythic autobiography. That it's a tale told by a director who feels himself pouring out his own life for the sake of the series' legacy, of a hero who must pour out his own life for the sake of his bloodline's legacy. Given what I've said so far, it should be no surprise that I view the taglines of Final Fantasy XVI with some consternation. It's hard to imagine that a game which is advertised by phrases such as, "The legacy of the crystals has shaped our history for long enough," and "Fate will fall," is likely to reflect the original meaning of Final Fantasy. This is only exacerbated by Final Fantasy VII Remake's shocking rejection of its own legacy. With that said, only time will tell whether Final Fantasy XVI will continue spurning the series' core myth. After all, Final Fantasy XV was advertised with a title card stating, "In Defiance of Divinity," a mere 8 months before release, and we all know how that turned out. And of course, even if Final Fantasy XVI is more a return to Fabula Nova Crystallis than classic Final Fantasy, that doesn't necessarily mean the end of the classic myth. After all, given the Final Fantasy series' apparent pursuit of immortality, it's unlikely to be the final Final Fantasy.